Beneath the hills of Jerusalem, there is a silence that archaeologists have spent centuries trying to break. Somewhere under the dust, the limestone, and the weight of three faiths, one of history's richest and most powerful kings is said to be buried. And yet, after everything modern science can throw at the ground, no one has ever found him. Not his coffin, not his bones, not even a single stone with his name carved into it. For a king whose wealth was once said to rival the sun itself, that silence is almost impossible to believe. Think about that for a second. This was a ruler whose gold, according to the old accounts, was so abundant that silver simply stopped being worth mentioning in his city. A ruler whose reputation traveled by camel caravan and by ship all the way to distant queens who crossed deserts just to see if the stories were true. And yet, somewhere along the way, in 3,000 years of conquest, earthquakes, rebuilding, and war, the one place that should be the easiest to identify, his own grave, simply vanished from the record. No army has ever announced they looted it. No later king ever bragged about desecrating it. It just disappears from history, as if the ground itself swallowed the evidence on purpose. And that single missing piece has turned into one of the longest-running obsessions in the entire field of biblical archaeology. It starts with a discovery that genuinely shook the archaeological world. In the ancient city of David, just south of Jerusalem's old city walls, a team led by archaeologist Eilat Mazar uncovered the remains of a massive stone structure buried beneath centuries of rubble. She believed it was nothing less than the palace of King David, Solomon's father. The find made headlines across the globe because, if she was right, it meant the Bible's account of a powerful centralized kingdom in Jerusalem wasn't just legend. It was standing evidence, buried right where the old texts said it should be. Skeptics pushed back immediately, arguing the dating was uncertain and the walls could belong to a later period. But one thing was undeniable. The ground beneath Jerusalem was still hiding secrets that could rewrite the story of an entire dynasty. And if the palace was real, then a far bigger question followed close behind. Where was the tomb of the son who inherited the throne? Where was Solomon? For thousands of years, people have been chasing the answer to that exact question, and every single time the trail goes cold. Crusader knights tunneled beneath sacred ground, convinced they were close. 19th century explorers tore through hillsides with picks and dynamite. Modern archaeologists with radar and laser scanners have mapped tunnel after tunnel beneath the city, and still, nothing conclusive has ever surfaced. No sealed chamber, no royal seal with his name, just fragments, theories, and a mystery that refuses to die. And there's an even stranger detail buried in the old historical record, one that rarely gets mentioned. The ancient historian Josephus, writing centuries after Solomon's reign, claimed that the tomb wasn't just lost by accident. He wrote that later rulers, including King Herod, actually knew where it was, and that Herod attempted to break into it in search of treasure, only to be driven back in fear after his men were reportedly killed by a burst of flame from deep within the vault. True or exaggerated, the story tells you something important. Even 2,000 years ago, people already believed the tomb was real, hidden, guarded, and worth risking everything to find. That a man powerful enough to rule an entire kingdom still walked away from it empty-handed and terrified. So stay with us, because before we get to what has actually been found beneath Jerusalem, and why so many experts believe the truth is closer than ever, you need to understand exactly who Solomon was, and why an entire empire would have gone to such extraordinary lengths to hide him forever. According to the ancient texts, Solomon inherited the throne of Israel from his father, King David, while still a young man, and almost immediately the kingdom transformed. Trade routes opened. Gold, spices, exotic woods, and precious stones began flowing into Jerusalem from distant lands. The Bible describes his wealth in staggering terms, silver becoming as common as stone in the streets of the city, and gold arriving by the shipload every single year. Whether or not those numbers were exaggerated by later scribes, the underlying story lines up with something real. Jerusalem, during this period, appears to have grown from a modest hill town into a genuine regional power. At the center of that transformation stood the first temple, a structure so significant that its construction is described in extraordinary detail in the ancient texts. Cedar wood was shipped in from the forests of Lebanon. Skilled craftsmen carved stone blocks so precisely that, according to tradition, no metal tools were heard on the construction site, the stones fitting together in near silence. Gold overlaid the interior walls. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in the ancient Israelite faith, was said to be placed within its innermost chamber. For centuries, that temple stood as the heart of the kingdom's identity. And Solomon was the man who built it. But Solomon wasn't only remembered for gold and architecture. He was remembered for his mind. The most famous story tells of two women who came before him, each claiming to be the mother of the same infant. Unable to determine the truth through testimony alone, Solomon proposed a brutal solution, cutting the child in two so each woman could have a share. One woman immediately begged him to spare the child and give it to the other, revealing herself through that single act of desperate love as the true mother. It was a piece of psychological insight disguised as a royal ruling, and it cemented Solomon's reputation as a ruler whose wisdom was almost unnatural for his time. That reputation ran so deep that entire books of proverbs, philosophy, and poetry found in the Hebrew scriptures came to be attributed directly to him, collections of practical wisdom and reflections on the meaning of a life spent chasing wealth and pleasure, written, according to tradition, by a king who had experienced more of both than almost anyone alive. Modern scholars debate how much of that writing genuinely dates back to his lifetime versus being composed later by scribes working under his name, but the fact that his identity became attached to an entire literary tradition, centuries after his death, says everything about how large he loomed in the cultural imagination of the ancient world. That reputation spread far beyond his own borders. Ancient texts describe the Queen of Sheba making the long journey north to test him personally, arriving with camels loaded with spices, gold, and precious stones, along with a series of difficult questions meant to expose him as a fraud. According to the story, she left convinced that everything she had heard about him, as extraordinary as it sounded, still fell short of the reality she witnessed in person. Historians still argue over where Sheba actually was, with candidates ranging from southern Arabia to the Horn of Africa. But the meeting itself has become one of the most retold encounters in ancient history, appearing not only in Hebrew scripture but later in Ethiopian and Islamic tradition as well. Ethiopian royal tradition goes even further, claiming that the queen returned home carrying Solomon's son, a child named Menelik, who would go on to found a dynasty that some Ethiopian rulers traced their bloodline back to for nearly 3,000 years, all the way into the 20th century. Whether or not any of that lineage claim holds up to historical scrutiny, it shows just how far Solomon's legend traveled, reshaping royal identity on an entirely different continent centuries after his death. Solomon's influence reportedly reached even further than diplomacy. Ancient records describe fleets of ships sailing to distant lands called Ophir and Tarshish in search of gold, ivory, and rare timber, places whose exact locations remain debated to this day. Some scholars place Ophir along the coast of East Africa, others in southern Arabia, or even further east toward India. What is far less debated is the existence of the copper mining operation in the Timna Valley in Israel's southern desert. For years, popular legend attached Solomon's name directly to those mines, and while modern radiocarbon dating has complicated the timeline, pushing some of the most intensive mining activity slightly earlier than his reign, the scale of industrial copper production found there is real, and it points to exactly the kind of organized, resource-rich kingdom the ancient texts describe. At a site archaeologists have nicknamed Slaves Hill, researchers uncovered scraps of dyed textile buried in the arid sand, brilliant reds and blues that had no business surviving for thousands of years in a desert smelting camp. The dye came from a rare Mediterranean mollusk, the kind of luxury material typically reserved for royalty and priests, found not in a palace, but in a remote smoke-filled mining camp in the middle of nowhere. It suggested something remarkable, that even the laborers running this desert operation were connected, directly or indirectly, to a wealthy and highly organized central authority, exactly the kind of kingdom Solomon was said to command. So by every measure, this was not some obscure regional chieftain. This was a king whose name, wealth, and reputation echoed across the ancient world, which makes what happened next almost impossible to explain. Because despite everything we know about how he lived, we have almost nothing that tells us where he was laid to rest. No tomb bearing his name has ever been confirmed, no inscription, no sarcophagus. For a king this legendary, that silence isn't just unusual, it's almost suspicious. And for centuries, that gap has pulled explorers, treasure hunters, and scholars back to the same unanswered question again and again. The search for Solomon's tomb didn't begin in a modern research lab. It began nearly 1,000 years ago, with armed men digging in the dark. During the Crusader period, knights stationed in Jerusalem became convinced that a network of underground vaults beneath the Temple Mount, structures actually built centuries later during the Roman period, were the remains of Solomon's own stables and treasury. That belief was so strong, it directly shaped the founding of one of history's most famous military orders, whose knights took their name from the ancient king simply because of where they were headquartered. They dug, they explored, and they found nothing that could be tied to Solomon himself, but the legend refused to fade. By the 19th century, the hunt had shifted from religious conviction to something closer to a race. European explorers arrived in Jerusalem with new tools and old obsessions. A British engineer named Charles Warren spent years tunneling beneath the city walls, mapping ancient shafts and passages in near total darkness, in some cases risking cave-ins just to trace where the old stones led. His teams worked by candlelight in shafts barely wide enough for a single man, sometimes crawling through ancient water channels flooded with sewage runoff from the modern city above, all in the hope of finding a passage that led toward a royal chamber. Warren never found Solomon, but the vertical shaft he discovered and mapped, later named after him, turned out to be a genuine engineering marvel from the era of the early Israelite kingdom. Proof that the city's ancient rulers had built infrastructure sophisticated enough to draw water safely from outside the walls during a siege, exactly the kind of resource that a real, defensible capital city would need. Around the same period, a French archaeologist named Louis Félicien de Saulcy became convinced he had finally found what everyone was searching for: a monumental rock-cut tomb complex just north of the old city, complete with a rolling stone door and elaborately carved sarcophagi. He announced to the world that he had discovered the burial place of the ancient kings of Judah, possibly even David and Solomon themselves. For a brief moment, it seemed the mystery was solved. Then the evidence caught up with the excitement. Later excavation and careful translation of an inscription found on one of the sarcophagi revealed the truth. The tomb didn't belong to Solomon at all. It belonged to a queen from a completely different era, roughly 1,000 years after Solomon's reign, a royal convert to Judaism from a kingdom near the Caspian Sea, who had chosen to be buried in Jerusalem out of religious devotion. The engineering inside was still genuinely impressive. A massive rolling stone disc sealing the entrance, one of the only tombs in the entire region built with that level of mechanical sophistication, and a network of chambers designed with false walls, meant to fool exactly the kind of grave robbers everyone assumed would eventually come looking. It just wasn't built for the king everyone hoped it was. The site is still called the Tomb of the Kings today, a name that stuck around long after the theory connecting it to Solomon had completely fallen apart. It remains one of the most elaborate ancient tombs ever found in Jerusalem, and it remains, definitively, not his. That failure didn't end the search, it just redirected it. If the tomb wasn't hiding in plain sight north of the walls, maybe it was hiding underneath the one place almost no one has ever been allowed to properly dig, the Temple Mount itself. Here's where the mystery runs directly into modern politics. The Temple Mount is one of the most sacred and most contested pieces of ground on the planet, home to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and administered under a delicate religious authority that strictly limits any archaeological excavation. Any large-scale dig there isn't just a scientific undertaking, it's a potential regional flashpoint. Because of that reality, the site where many believe the first temple and possibly royal burial vaults once stood remains almost entirely unexcavated in the modern sense. Archaeologists have had to work around the edges instead, sifting through soil removed during unauthorized construction work decades ago, piecing together fragments of pottery and seals from material that was never properly excavated in place. It's a frustrating, indirect way to study one of the most important sites in human history, and it's a major reason the tomb question has never been definitively closed. So attention shifted south back toward the city of David, the oldest inhabited part of ancient Jerusalem, the same area where Eilat Mazar had already found what she believed was David's palace. If the kings lived there, logic suggested they might have been buried nearby as well. And this is where things get genuinely interesting, because the city of David sits right next to a steep, terraced hillside in the village of Silwan. And cut directly into that rock face is one of the most overlooked archaeological sites in the entire region, a cluster of monumental rock-cut tombs known as the Silwan Necropolis. These aren't simple graves. Some of them are massive carved chambers with sculpted facades, pyramid-shaped roofs, and inscriptions written in an old Hebrew script dating back to exactly the period historians associate with the First Temple Kingdom. One tomb inscription, badly damaged but still partially legible, mentions a royal steward, someone who managed the palace on behalf of the king, and warns that a curse will fall on anyone who dares to open the tomb or disturb the bones inside. A warning like that, carved in stone 3,000 years ago, is not something you write for an ordinary person. That particular structure is now known simply as the Tomb of the Royal Steward, and it sits only a short walk from another monumental chamber locals have called the Tomb of Pharaoh's Daughter for centuries, its pyramid-shaped roof visible for anyone who knows where to look on the Silwan hillside, even though the name has never actually been confirmed by any inscription. Together, these carved facades make up one of the largest concentrations of monumental First Temple-era tombs anywhere in the region, a royal necropolis hiding in plain sight, half swallowed by a modern residential neighborhood that grew up directly on top of it. For decades, some archaeologists have quietly argued that Silwan, not the Temple Mount, may be the true resting place of Judah's royal dynasty, including, potentially, Solomon himself. The problem is that many of these tombs were reused, repurposed, and physically altered over the centuries. Byzantine monks carved chapels directly into some of the ancient burial chambers. Later residents converted others into storage rooms, and even at one point, cisterns and cellars for the houses built around them. Whatever inscriptions or remains once identified, who exactly rested inside have largely been chiseled away, deliberately or accidentally, by roughly 2,500 years of continuous habitation on top of them. Which brings us to one of the strangest and most frustrating truths about this entire search. It's entirely possible that Solomon's tomb has already been found and simply not recognized for what it is, because whatever identifying marks it once carried were destroyed long before anyone thought to look for them. There's another theory that gets far less attention, but deserves serious consideration, and it has nothing to do with hidden chambers or curses. It has to do with catastrophe. In the 6th century before the Common Era, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar besieged and ultimately destroyed Jerusalem, leveling the first temple and much of the city around it. If a royal necropolis existed close to the temple complex, it may not have survived that destruction intact. Ancient armies didn't just kill and enslave, they looted systematically. And royal tombs, filled with gold and precious objects by tradition, would have been an obvious target. It's entirely possible that whatever once marked Solomon's resting place was stripped bare and buried under rubble more than 2,500 years ago, long before any of the explorers who came looking for it were even born. Archaeologists have found thick layers of ash and collapsed masonry across multiple excavation sites in the city of David, dated to precisely that period of destruction, a physical scorch line in the earth, marking the moment the kingdom's golden age came to a violent, sudden end. Entire households were buried under burning rooftops within minutes, their pottery and belongings crushed and preserved almost exactly as they were left, giving archaeologists a devastating frozen snapshot of the exact day everything collapsed. If a royal tomb complex existed anywhere near the surface at that time, it's difficult to imagine it escaping that same wave of systematic destruction untouched. And if that's true, then in a strange way, the mystery isn't really about a hidden door waiting to be opened. It's about a memory that was erased on purpose by an invading army that understood exactly what kind of symbol they were destroying. Still, the archaeological picture beneath Jerusalem keeps getting more detailed every year, and that's what keeps this story alive. Ground-penetrating radar surveys across the city of David and the surrounding slopes have revealed networks of tunnels and voids that haven't been fully excavated, some dating to exactly the period in question, some clearly later additions from Roman and Byzantine builders who reused the same hillside for centuries. Every new excavation season uncovers more seals, more pottery, more fragments of monumental architecture that keep pushing the timeline of a genuinely powerful, organized kingdom back toward exactly when the ancient texts say Solomon reigned. None of it, so far, includes a body. None of it includes a name carved specifically as his. But piece by piece, the case for a real historical Solomon, ruling a real wealthy Jerusalem, keeps getting stronger, even as his final resting place remains stubbornly out of reach. Some of the most recent radar work has focused on a section of hillside beneath modern buildings that were constructed decades before anyone understood what might be sitting underneath them, meaning any confirmed void down there can't simply be excavated by digging a hole. Researchers now have to negotiate with property owners, city planners, and religious authorities just to get permission to insert a camera through a narrow borehole, inch by careful inch, into spaces that may not have been seen by human eyes in nearly 3,000 years. There's also a darker layer to this story that rarely makes it into the popular retellings, the sheer number of forgeries and fabricated claims that have surrounded Solomon's legacy over the decades. Artifacts have surfaced on the antiquities market claiming direct connections to him, seals, rings, and inscribed objects sold to private collectors for enormous sums, only for later analysis to expose them as modern fakes designed specifically to exploit the fame of his name. One inscribed ivory pomegranate, once celebrated as possibly the only surviving artifact directly from the first temple itself, was eventually deemed likely to be a forgery after closer inspection of the inscription's wear patterns. A separate stone tablet, known as the Jehoash inscription, surfaced years later claiming to describe repairs made to the first temple, language lifted almost directly from the biblical account. It caused a sensation before investigators discovered the ancient patina had been artificially applied over a genuinely old stone, a forgery clever enough to fool experts for months. The demand for a physical connection to Solomon is so intense that an entire underground industry of fraud has grown up around satisfying it, which makes legitimate archaeologists even more cautious about announcing any new discovery tied to his name. So where does that leave us today? Beneath the streets of Jerusalem, layered under 3,000 years of conquest, construction, and continuous habitation, there is almost certainly more waiting to be found. The city of David, excavations continue year after year, inching deeper and wider with each new funding cycle. The Silwan tombs remain only partially studied, their eroded inscriptions still being re-examined with modern imaging technology that can sometimes read what the naked eye cannot. And the Temple Mount, the most likely location according to tradition, remains almost entirely off-limits, a locked door that may never fully open for archaeological science, at least not in the way researchers would need to settle this once and for all. What we're left with is a portrait built from fragments, a genuinely powerful kingdom that did exist. A temple that likely did stand exactly where tradition says it stood. A king whose wisdom, wealth, and diplomatic reach left an impression so deep it echoed into 3 of the world's major religious traditions. And somewhere beneath all of that, a resting place that has managed to stay hidden or destroyed or simply unrecognized for roughly 3,000 years, despite the best efforts of crusaders, colonial explorers, and modern scientists armed with radar that can see through solid rock. Maybe the tomb really is sitting under Silwan right now, disguised as a Byzantine chapel or a forgotten cistern, waiting for someone to notice the pattern in the stone. Maybe it was destroyed during the Babylonian conquest, its gold melted down and its location erased on purpose so many centuries ago that no record ever survived. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that keeps archaeologists coming back year after year, it's still sitting exactly where legend always placed it, underneath the most contested and most heavily guarded religious site on the planet, waiting for the day politics finally allows science to dig deep enough to find out for certain. Until that day comes, Solomon remains exactly what he's been for 3,000 years, a king everyone can describe in extraordinary detail, right down to his temple, his wealth, and his court, and yet a grave nobody on earth can actually point to and prove. And maybe that unresolved ending is the most fitting one of all for a ruler whose entire legend was built on the idea that some truths take patience, wisdom, and time to uncover, and that the answers worth having are rarely the ones that come easily or quickly. If this story pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed, because Jerusalem still has more secrets buried beneath it than any single video could ever cover, and the next discovery could be the one that finally changes everything.